20 miles outside of Boston, in the town of Lincoln, Massachusetts, the house built by German architect Walter Gropius in 1938 receives hundreds of visitors each year.
The traditional wisdom that has followed the history of the modern movement is that Walter Gropius landed here in the fall of 1937 to take over the chairmanship of the architecture department at Harvard and brought with him modern architecture. There are several things that are wrong with that. There were outposts there already. There were several modern houses, and people who were sympathetic to the ideas of modernism and understood what it was and were beginning to practice it in this area before he ever got there.
One house, a little more than 2 miles away, predates Gropius by more than a year.
It's fascinating, again, this sort of myth that the Gropius house was the first modern house in New England, when in fact just around the corner there was this one that was designed a year plus earlier. It's because Gropius was a name, and because Gropius had a platform, and because Gropius came from Europe.
The real first modern house in Lincoln, built in 1937, was the residence of a young architect named Henry Hoover. In a career that spanned 60 years, Hoover designed more than 50 modern houses, placing an indelible mark on the character of neighborhoods and the lives of families.
Gropius came to town and everybody knew about it. Hoover was in town and he wasn't a name, and he had a much greater impact on the town of Lincoln, in fact the western suburbs, where he was actually quite prolific.
In 1934, architect Henry Hoover climbed to the top of a hill on the eastern edge of the town of Lincoln. Overlooking the Cambridge Reservoir, the land commanded a spectacular view. Hoover bought 2 acres. He paid $1,000.
The land came first, and the house grew out of that land.
A year later, Hoover sketched the house he intended to build, and it was not what anyone might expect.
All of a sudden we have a drawing from 1935, which is conceptual, but it's the first physical evidence that this house was in his mind. And is, if anything, it's a modern house with a vengeance.
I heard from talking with the family that when he went to get financing to build this house, they didn't want to give it to him because it looked like a filling station.
But despite the objections, 2 years later the house was finished, with a design that was clearly aligned with the ideas of the emerging modern movement in architecture.
The traditional approach was, of course, you have your 5-bay colonial house facing the road, regardless of what direction the sun was going to hit it in. Your living room was on one side, your dining room was on the other, kitchen in the back. It was a pretty predictable format. The way that the modern home worked was really quite different because it was suited directly to that individual landscape. So if the view was going in one direction, that's where your principal living room, dining room, bedrooms were all facing. And the area that didn't get direct sunlight, the area that didn't have views, became service areas.
Today, as we look back, it is difficult to understand why in 1935 Henry Hoover decided to build a modern house. There was little in his background to predict this choice. Hoover grew up in Idaho and studied architecture at the University of Washington. There he exhibited an extraordinary talent for drawing, for which he gained tremendous recognition throughout his career.
One mark of a traditional education is his spectacular drafting ability, which the modern movement de-emphasized. And so had he trained 20 or 30 years later, he might not have been nearly as skilled a draftsperson as he was.
After the University of Washington, Hoover attended Harvard's Graduate School of Architecture from 1924 to 1926. There, his training was based on the traditional method of the French École des Beaux-Arts. In looking at the classical material Hoover studied, It is easy to think that in designing a modern house, he broke from his training.
He didn't break from his training. He exploited his training to solve the problem that he was most interested in, which was how does one design for a contemporary lifestyle, which is more informal.
As a student of the Beaux-Arts methods, Hoover was taught to choose one element that was most important in his building, and that is exactly what he did.
He said, okay, for me, the site is the most important thing. This is his partie. This is a very French word. It means to stand, to take a stand, you know. And at the école, the first thing you did was decide on your partie. A house is its site. Okay, so now how do we distribute the functions of contemporary life so as to honor the site?
The way to do that is to bring people to the important location with a real sense of arrival.
You have to stage it as a promenade or procession. It has to have some grace to it.
In order to celebrate his partie, the site, Hoover brings people to what would typically be seen as the back of the house. He has them climb a set of stairs, come through a door to more stairs, and then finally turn toward the light. And there it is, the all-important reason the house is here.
When you go to Hoover's house, you know instantaneously it's about the site. It's there.
In the original design of the house, the center room had a kind of grandeur with a very high ceiling, a centered fireplace, and a dark wall. In 1955, he made a change, lowering the ceiling and replacing the windows with large sheets of glass.
Why wouldn't you, as materials become even more available to you, why wouldn't you take advantage to have sheets of glass rather than small panes of glass?
For Hoover's growing family of 3 children, the design of the house enhanced their lives exactly as he intended.
We loved looking outdoors in the different seasons. It's just as beautiful in the spring as it is in the winter. The reservoir has changed its configuration over the years. The trees have grown up, but it's still a beautiful aspect, and we love looking at it no matter what time of day or what time of year.
It was very flexible spaces, and I think he ordered them, arranged them in a very human way. The private wing was all in one corner, and the utilities and the kitchen and the maid were all in another corner. But in the center congregated the family, and the living room was in the middle of that house.
His daughter Elizabeth writes from England that Father's working office was in what we called the study, right behind the living room fireplace wall. So the open-plan house lent itself to considerable, at a distance, transparency of Father's procedures, his comings and goings. While the interior spaces accommodated family life well, for Hoover, the spaces outside the house were just as important as those inside.
He was working the land as a sculptor would model clay. He would actually do this himself, lugging things, rocks up the hill. Let's see how this looks. And he would stand back and say, it was good.
The ability to integrate the land with the house was an element of his work that Hoover developed at the very start of his career. In 1926, having just graduated from Harvard, Hoover was given a fellowship, allowing him to travel through Europe for 2 years and to record his observations in his own hand.
He noticed with great concern and interest the gardens, such as the Villa Lante and so forth. He spoke endlessly about those long after he was there in Europe. So the gardens made as much of an impression that he saw in Europe as the structures.
Returning from Europe, Hoover received an opportunity to capitalize on his interest in gardens with an offer to work with the noted landscape designer Fletcher Steele.
Fletcher Steele was among the more interesting landscape architects in the period of the 1920s and 30s, who was, again, bringing a very traditional point of view to his designs, but was also quite interested in what was going on in contemporary landscape design, especially in Europe.
At the time, Steele was working in western Massachusetts on an estate called Naumkeag, owned by Mabel Choate, the daughter of an American ambassador.
It looks as though Hoover was there when many landscape gardens were built that were mostly garden, but he was also there when they were doing walls, garden walls and pavilions and gazebos and trellises and all these features. And it's just as possible that ideas were coming from Hoover to Steele as from Steele to Hoover.
Later, a biographer of Steele's wrote of Hoover that the scope and quality of his work was so remarkable, his draftsmanship so detailed and fine, that it was said his drawings evoked real gardens. Thanks to Hoover, clients could hear water splashing in unbuilt fountains, sniff roses on imaginary trellises. The gardens of Naumkeag are said to be some of the most imaginative and impressive in all New England. Most famous of all are the Blue Steps.
The Blue Stairs at Naumkeag are certainly one of the iconic images of landscape in the 20th century in America. The idea of using these thin pipe rails to come down with the semicircular rails at the landings, and then the planting of the birches along each side, just makes a terrific composition. We know Hoover was involved in the design of it, and there are drawings of it in his hand. How much of it's Hoover's and how much of it's Steele's, who of course was his boss, we don't know.
The experience of working with Fletcher Steele was one that reflected Hoover's love of the natural world and one that shaped his entire career.
Though the idea of a connection between landscape and the house was fundamental to ideas of modern architecture dating back to Frank Lloyd Wright, Hoover was probably one of the few architects who had the experience and the know-how based on working in Steele's office to actually make some very sensitive, convincing connections between a house and its site.
After 10 years with Fletcher Steele, Hoover built his Lincoln House and then opened his own architectural firm. His first clients, Glennon and Elizabeth Gilboy, had bought the land next door to his house. While he designed the house to meet their needs exactly, the current owners, Amir and Suzanne Hoveda, feel as though Hoover designed it for them.
I'm a scientist, and a lot of what I do is very creative. I have to come up with new ideas. And I think what this house has done for me, in addition to being an absolutely a gorgeous place to live, it has been very inspirational.
It was only the second house Hoover created, but already the features that became his fingerprints were tried and perfected. Once again, the site rules the design. The house even follows the contours of the land.
Most of his houses, or all of his houses, are asymmetrical. They go up and down according to the land's topography. They sit on the land as natural as a rock and a tree.
As he did with his own house, Hoover brought people to the north side of the building in order to extend the arrival at the magnificent view.
Many people are so shocked when they walk into this house, because when you enter the house, you see a couple of small windows, you don't see much, but all of a sudden, by one turn, he completely surprises you, shocks you into what you see. So he was a great dramatist. I mean, he set this stage for you.
While the house is suited to the site, it was also suited to the original owners in what has become the hallmark of a modern house.
Houses of the modern movement were built around individual needs, and what that really meant is that an architect working with the client was asking people not what they liked out of a catalog, but it was more of a give and take, an interview. What are the pieces that one needs to in fact live in a house? And so they talked about different spaces, they talked about individual requirements, and the house grew organically from the requirements that the individual client had.
The original owners of this house, the Gilboys, were both accomplished pianists, and so the living room was built to accommodate 2 grand pianos.
There are lights on each stool that they sat and played their piano. The ceiling of this room and the walls of this room are for sound. There are sound panels.
Everything was custom built for the Gilboys. Hoover even designed the furniture.
He makes you laugh. He has a lot of he has drawers in the house that at the beginning you don't even know how to open them. He has a little push button somewhere hidden that you have to push the button to open, to the drawer to open. He has another drawer in the library that opens at a very odd angle. He was very, very playful.
Walking through the Gilboy house, it is easy to forget that it was built more than 70 years ago. Only the neatly organized dressing room offers a reminder that this is a creation of the 1930s. The timeless design shows us that what was important then is still important today, that a house in a beautiful setting should offer a space for every season.
So to us, the library is where we live in the winter, with the fireplace, the low ceiling, and the porch is where we live in the summer.
While the house was built for musicians, today, 70 years later, an artist and a scientist are finding tremendous pleasure in what they consider to be small strokes of genius in the design of their house.
He has a subtle bend to the window in the living room, and by just having that very small addition to his window completely opens up your view from the porch into the living room. Although you're sitting outside, you're still sitting inside, and that to me is a stroke of genius. I mean, by just a very almost that little stroke of a pen, he was able to completely open up the space. Every artist has 1 or 2 or 3 or many works of art that everything just comes together and works. In this house, everything in the house just absolutely comes together and works, and I keep discovering those.
I consider all of these small modern houses of the 1930s and 1940s works of art. They are unique, individual expressions of both the architect, the builder, and the client. And when you come together with a product that is so individual, you know when it sings, you know when it resonates. And I think a lot of Hoover's houses really do that.
In the years following construction of the Gilboy house, Hoover continued to attract new clients, and by the mid-1950s his houses, often hard to see from the road, were tucked into the hills and woods of many of Boston's western suburbs. By that time, modern was in.
After World War II, all the builders and everybody said, you know what? We go modern now. This is so much easier. We have so much we have to build. We haven't done anything because of the Depression and the war. We haven't really, most people hadn't done anything for 15 years, and there was this incredible demand.